He thought the ruthless alien girl would devour him, just not like that. Dane trudged through the biting cold, every step crunching in the snow. He'd lost count of how many days he'd been moving in these mountains. His breath turned to frost against the dark fabric covering his face, and the wind threatened to peel the skin off his cheeks, but he pressed on, scanning the jagged terrain with an ex-soldier's vigilance. The swirling gusts made it nearly impossible to hear anything beyond a few feet, which was a disadvantage. He was being hunted. He had the scar to prove it, a jagged reminder etched into the left side of his jaw from a near-fatal mission gone. Wrong. Now, he was on the run from the same intergalactic dominion he'd once served. They'd left him with a price on his head and a conviction in his heart that he could never trust anyone again. Yet as much as the Dominion wanted him dead, some part of him suspected there were worse things out here than a kill squad, and that suspicion felt like a weight pressing on his lungs, urging him to keep his gaze flicking in every direction, never resting, never safe. He reached a narrow pass flanked by precarious cliffs. Snow-laden rock faces loomed high above, threatening to collapse at the slightest vibration. He paused, knuckles popping as he flexed his fingers in a reflexive motion he couldn't shake, an old habit from years of bracing himself before leaping into the fray. The hush of the surroundings unnerved him. In the endless white, the faintest, in shape or motion, could stand out. He squinted, scanning left then right, nothing. He exhaled and shifted his weight, preparing to move. He caught a fleeting motion in his peripheral vision, something dark moving against the pale background. Instinct had him ducking low as a thin blade of energy sliced through the air where his head had been only a second before. He dove to the ground, rolling in the snow, his heart pounding, adrenaline spiking. He came up to one knee, drew his sidearm, and returned fire with a short burst of crackling blue plasma that cut a searing line across the rock wall. A figure erupted from behind a boulder, black bodysuit blending into the shadows. Emerald skin glinted in the cold light, and a deadly hum vibrated through the air. Dine's grip tightened on his weapon. He'd heard rumors of the Zale Dominions, top operatives, aliens whose lethal grace rivaled any human's raw power. He'd never come face to face with one until now. In a flash, she disappeared behind another outcrop, moving so smoothly that it seemed like a trick of the eye. "Show yourself," he barked, pressing his back to the cliff. His breath hissed between clenched teeth. For a moment, there was silence, just the roaring wind and the hammering of blood in his ears. Then she materialized behind him, impossibly fast. Her arms snaked around his torso, hooking under his chin, and the edge of a blade pressed against his throat. He froze, every muscle coiling, his pulse racing with the knowledge that if he so much as twitched wrong, he'd die right here, on his knees in the snow. Her voice was low, dangerous. "You're a long way from safety, human." He gritted his teeth and slammed his elbow backward, aiming for her ribs. She twisted, evading with a fluid motion. With the break in her grip, he whipped around to face her, close enough to see the shift in her eyes. A flicker of gold that contrasted sharply with the deep black from just moments ago. She had to be Vera, or at least one of her kind. The name circulated among soldiers like a dark legend, the assassin of the Zale, rumored to have survived impossible missions and left no survivors in her wake. The faint hum in her throat resonated in the frigid air. She crouched low, blade held at a calculated angle, and sized him up with a predatory intensity that made his scar itch. His knuckles cracked again as he flexed his hands, shifting on the balls of his feet, readying himself for the fight of his life. They lunged at the same time, steel meeting plasma bursts in a flurry of strikes that illuminated the snow in a strobe of cold blue light. She was fast, far faster than anyone he'd crossed blades with, but he wasn't slow, and he'd survived enough lethal skirmishes to know how to adapt. Their breath came out in ragged clouds as they traded blows, sliding across the snowy ground, each looking for an opening to deliver a fatal strike. He parried her blade with the butt of his sidearm, swinging a powerful roundhouse that grazed her shoulder. She hissed at the impact, eyes flaring gold, and slashed upward. He jerked back in time, but not fast enough to avoid a sizzling cut across his bicep that burned through layers of cloth and skin. He let out a snarl of pain, adrenaline surging, fueling the savage dance. But then, overhead, he heard the roar of engines. He recognized the distinctive hum of Dominion gunships. Tension spiked, and for the briefest second they both paused, glancing skyward. A black silhouette cut across the swirling clouds, heading straight for the pass. "They're not yours," Dane spat, breathing hard. "They're after me, but I'll wager they've got orders to kill anyone in their path." Vera's eyes flickered, her purr-like hum buzzed at a different pitch. "And you think I'd care about your pathetic human squads? They aren't all human," Dane replied. "They're Dominion, my ex-commanders, your kind's sworn enemy. If they spot you, they'll kill you too." She bristled, but didn't deny it. The rumors about her might have been many things, but not even an elite Zale assassin would willingly engage a squadron alone in these conditions. Hesitation carved a new tension between them. It was the briefest window, and neither wanted to take it, but neither saw another choice. The thunderous approach of the gunship confirmed the worst. They'd be sitting ducks if they didn't move. "We can settle this later," he snapped. She growled, "We will." They took off down the narrow pass together, an uneasy truce forged under the threat of something worse. The wind whipped at their faces as they sprinted, hearts pounding, in unison, propelled by survival. The roar of the engines grew louder, accompanied by the piercing wail of energy cannons charging up. Plasma fire streaked through the sky, scorching the snowy terrain, creating bursts of steam as ice melted instantly on contact. Dane ducked behind a massive rock outcropping, pulling Vera with him before she could protest. Another blast hammered against the cliff face, dislodging an avalanche of snow and debris. "Move!" Dane roared. He shoved her out of the way as a chunk of ice crashed down. She spun, glaring at him with those shifting eyes, but he saw the calculation behind her gaze. The kill squad wasn't playing around. They wanted to bury them both. They sprinted across a ridge, where the path dropped into a narrow ravine. The gunship soared overhead, arcs of plasma raining down. Vera leapt with feline grace onto a ledge, her suit blending with the shadows, while Dane followed, shoulders straining under the effort to cling to the frozen rock. Climbing in these conditions was a dangerous gamble, but staying in the open pass was worse. They reached a shallow cave carved into the side of the mountain. It was just enough to protect them from a direct overhead assault. Panting, Dane scanned the skies. The gunship circled, searching, but the ravine's overhang and the storm's intensity seemed to shield them for the moment. Vera pressed against the rocky wall, glaring at him with thinly veiled hostility. He bled from the shallow cut on his arm, the heat from the wound contrasting fiercely with the biting cold around them. He noticed the faint tremor in Vera's stance, a sign of how close they'd both come to death. "Don't think for a second this means I won't slit your throat when we're clear," she hissed. The purr in her throat vibrated at a lower register, an ongoing threat. He wiped the trickle of blood from his mouth, scowling. "I wouldn't expect otherwise!" Every fiber of his being wanted to keep fighting. But a pragmatic part of him realized that, for now, their best chance lay in cooperation. The kill squad was out there, and the swirling storm was intensifying, making the entire mountain range a death trap. They hunkered in silence for a while, letting the storm's roar fill the gap where words might have been. Neither wanted to speak more than necessary, but neither wanted to die, either. Over the next hour, the howling wind and the barrage of swirling snow built to a crescendo until venturing outside would be nothing short of suicide. Dane adjusted his black tactical vest, checking his ammo supply. "Low," he swore softly under his breath. Vera eyed him, then the wound on his arm. Her eyes flicked to a deep violet shade before settling back to black. He couldn't decipher the color-coded emotions yet, but he sensed a shift, as though she debated whether to waste bandages on him or simply let him bleed. Without warning, she stepped forward, voice tight. "You'll slow us down if that gets infected." She reached into a pouch on her belt, withdrawing a small canister of antiseptic foam. He tensed at her approach, but recognized the logic. She applied it with practiced efficiency, her touch surprisingly gentle, though her expression remained hard. When she finished, he flexed his arm experimentally. The wound still hurt, but the foam had staunched the bleeding. "Thanks," he muttered. She didn't answer. Outside, the wind battered the mountainside relentlessly, threatening to choke off all sound but its own. Eventually, even Vera seemed to grow weary of the silence. Her eyes flickered gold again, as though curiosity warred with her lethal instincts. "Why are they hunting you?" she asked, her tone flat, yet laced with that subtle hum in her throat. He met her gaze, weighing how much to reveal. She'd tried to kill him once, maybe still intended to, but if they were going to survive this storm, maybe a shred of cooperation was necessary. "I'm a defector," he said. "Did things for the intergalactic dominion I'm not proud of. Went rogue when I found out what they were really up to. I took something that could turn the tide of the war. They want me silenced, permanently." Her eyes narrowed. "Intel?" "In names, locations, strategic weaknesses," he replied grimly. "But it won't matter if I freeze to death out here." She scoffed, leaning back against the cold stone. "You humans start wars. You can't finish." But there was an edge to her voice, and he sensed that the mention of intel piqued her interest. Could be valuable to the Zale, could be a bargaining chip. He was no fool. He recognized that behind every assassin's blade was a politician's plan. The hours dragged on. The temperature dropped further. An unexpected wave of exhaustion hit Dane, and he slumped against the wall, fighting the urge to sleep. He'd been on the move for days, adrenaline alone sustaining him. But now, stuck in a frigid cave with no immediate fight, his body demanded rest. His eyelids grew heavy, head nodding forward. Vera stirred from her own watchful position. She glanced at him, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Stay awake," she commanded, "or you'll die in your sleep." He let out a bitter laugh. "I've survived worse conditions." She stared at him for a moment, then, as though coming to a decision, she moved closer. The heat of her alien body cut through the cold, startling him. Her suit was some advanced material that held warmth, and her presence was a stark contrast to the freezing air. She pressed against him, as if sharing body heat, an odd moment of forced intimacy from someone who had only hours. Ego tried to kill him. He blinked, suddenly hyper-aware of the way her thighs flexed under her skin-tight suit, the curve of her waist, the faintest shift in her eyes, as she studied him in turn. She radiated a commanding aura, one that made his pulse spike. She must have felt his reaction, because her gaze flicked downward, noticing the clench of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the bruises forming beneath the gear he wore. When she spoke, her tone was low. "Don't read too much into this. I won't let my prey die of the cold. I'd rather kill you myself." His heart pounded. An electric charge hung in the small gap between them. He could smell something sharp and earthy, maybe the scent of her alien physiology. It was unlike anything he'd encountered before, magnetic, dangerous. He had to swallow back a surge of conflicting impulses, the instinct to pull away, and another to sink into that warmth. He said nothing, not trusting himself to speak. Then the silent tension was shattered by the distant whine of a transport engine. Both of them stiffened. They peered outside to see lights cutting through the snow. Another gunship. Possibly ground troops, scanning for survivors. The storm still raged, but the Dominion wasn't giving up its hunt. They didn't speak as they gathered their gear, the tenuous truce sealed by necessity. In the midst of that silent, adrenaline-fueled preparation, Vera shot him a sidelong glance. He tried to ignore how the gold in her eyes glowed briefly, a clear signal of her heightened emotion. Fear? Desire? He wasn't sure. He only knew that after they made it out of this cave alive, their fragile alliance could crumble at any second. They slipped out into the storm, hearts pounding. The wind howled, biting at their exposed skin. Visibility was near zero, which was a gift and a curse. The swirling snow provided cover from the gunship's searchlights, but it also meant one wrong step could send them tumbling into a crevasse. Still, they pressed onward, guided by some unspoken plan to circle around the mountainside, hoping to avoid the Dominion's net. Every so often they heard the crackle of distant energy fire, and they'd duck low, pressing themselves flat against ice and rock as the troopers swept through. Any sense of trust between them was overshadowed by the immediate crisis. One slip and they'd be found. One betrayal and someone would end up with a blade in their throat. Yet, ironically, that sharpened tension kept them both on edge, and in a brutal way it bonded them, forging a dangerous chemistry in the midst of mortal peril. At the crest of the slope, they found a vantage point overlooking a small plateau, dotted with jagged rocks. Through the dancing haze of white, Dane spotted movement, Dominion troopers, half a dozen, scanning the terrain with handheld thermal scopes. There was no going around. The pass was too narrow, and the mountain on either side was sheer ice. Vera crouched beside him, lips pulled back in a snarl. "We have to fight." He nodded grimly. "We take them by surprise." He checked his plasma rifle, ensured the charge was still good. "They'll expect a direct assault, but you're faster. If you can circle around—" "Don't tell me what to do!" she snapped, but the flicker in her eyes betrayed a grudging acceptance of the plan. With a final glare, she vanished into the swirling snow. Dawn took a breath, centering himself, ignoring the stinging cold in his lungs. He sprang from cover, charging toward the nearest trooper with raw force. The shock on the man's face was brief as Dane's rifle butt smashed into his helmet. Plasma blasts lit up the night, scorching the snow in brilliant arcs. Dane rolled behind a boulder, returning fire with crisp efficiency. He heard shouts, curses, the hiss of scorching blasts. From the corner of his eye, he saw Vera materialize behind another trooper. Her movements were deadly poetry, fluid arcs of her blade slicing through armor. The wind carried her almost soundlessly from one soldier to the next. They never stood a chance. In less than a minute, the plateau was silent, except for the crackle of energy dissipating into the storm. Dane could feel his pulse hammering, the high of combat surging through his veins. Vera stood over the last trooper, her blade pressed to his throat. Her eyes glowed black as she hissed something in her own tongue. The man choked, lifting a trembling hand. Dane's heart kicked. If the soldier spoke, it might give them vital intel. But Vera, with a harsh flick of her blade, ended his life before he could utter a word. Dane scowled, stepping over the bodies. "We could have questioned him," he barked. Her gaze cut to him, eyes shifting to a dangerous gold. "Humans. Always wanting answers you don't deserve. He was Dominion filth." "Maybe so, but he had a radio." Dane yanked a comm device off one of the fallen troopers and turned the dial, listening. Static. Then faint chatter. Vera tensed at the sound of garbled voices. "They're coming." He nodded. The radio traffic was urgent, indicating a larger force was inbound. "We have to move." They scavenged what they could, ammo, thermal blankets, rations, and disappeared into the blizzard before reinforcements arrived. The fierce wind masked their tracks, but it also numbed their bodies. Hours later, as dusk turned into a dark, moonless night, they found a deeper cavern system. It was well hidden by an overhang of ice, and only someone desperate for shelter would think to check inside. Vera examined the entrance, her eyes narrowing, as though searching for signs of danger. Satisfied, she slipped in. Dane followed, weary and nearly at his limit. The air inside was marginally warmer, but still freezing. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, where ancient stalactites of ice hung overhead like sharpened spears. The place smelled of damp stone and old, stale air. They set up a makeshift camp, using a small heating unit from the troopers' supplies. The flickering orange glow cast dancing shadows across the frozen walls. Vera paced the perimeter, scanning for threats, while Dane forced down an energy ration that tasted like chalk. His arm throbbed under the bandage, and the exhaustion in his body made every movement feel heavy. "What's your plan?" Vera finally asked, her voice echoing faintly in the icy chamber. He met her gaze. "To survive." She approached, crossing her arms. "That's not enough," he scoffed. "It has to be. You don't trust me, and I sure as hell don't trust you, so all we have is this moment, staying alive." Her lips curled in a near snarl. "You're more trouble than I expected. Human. And your intel... I can see how valuable it is. Perhaps more valuable than your life." His jaw tightened. "I'm well aware." A tense silence followed, the only sound their breathing, still ragged from the climb and the firefight. The heat unit glowed softly between them, creating an unsteady circle of warmth. Dane watched her, saw how the taut lines of her bodysuit revealed every shift of muscle, every poised moment of lethal grace. The anger in her eyes clashed with something else, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even attraction. He felt it too, a tug in his chest, that both infuriated and pulled him in. She was a hunter, an assassin, but she was also mesmerizing in her alien ferocity. As if reading his thoughts, she tilted her head, letting her eyes roam over his body, taking in the black tactical gear, the broad lines of his shoulders, the scar carved into his jaw. For a moment, neither looked away. Then she broke the stare, turning sharply. "I'll keep watch first," she said, her tone clipped. "Sleep if you can. We'll move at dawn." Dane nodded, leaning against a rock formation, rifle in his lap. The air was still bitingly cold, but the small heat source kept it at least tolerable. He didn't fully sleep, more drifted in a half-lidded rest, jolting awake at every small noise. Whenever he opened his eyes, he saw her silhouette against the flickering glow, unwavering, lethal, beautiful in a way that made no sense for a killer. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of him, and his mind faded. He dreamt of missions gone, wrong, of men he'd killed, of decisions that left him a traitor in the Dominion's eyes. His last thought before unconsciousness took him was of the alien assassin and the chaotic desire in her gaze. He woke to her hand on his shoulder, shaking him none too gently. "We have company," she said. He sat up with a groan, grabbing his rifle. Through the narrow tunnel, the faint hum of voices and footsteps echoed. More Dominion, pushing deeper into the cavern system. They must have tracked the radio signal or noticed the bodies on the plateau. They extinguished the heat unit, plunging the cavern into darkness. Eye contact was impossible, but they'd already formed a silent understanding. They'd fight as one, at least until the threat was gone. Dane crept forward, pressing himself against the cold wall, while Vera disappeared into the black, her soft steps barely audible. The first trooper entered cautiously, the beam of a helmet light dancing on the icy walls. Dane waited until he was close, then lunged, clamping a hand over the trooper's mouth and slamming the butt of his rifle into his temple. The trooper collapsed without a sound. Vera took out the next one with a swift slice of her blade, the body thumping softly to the cavern floor. They advanced deeper, systematically clearing each tunnel. The Dominion squad was larger than expected, 10, maybe 12 soldiers. Plasma fire flashed like lightning in the darkness, lighting up glimpses of the battle. Dane ducked behind a rock spire as blasts ricocheted around him. He fired back, taking down 2. The hiss and sizzle of energy set the cavern's walls aglow. Suddenly, an explosion rocked the chamber, blasting chunks of ice from the ceiling. A trooper had thrown a thermite charge. Dane flung himself sideways as searing shards rained down. Pain ignited in his leg as a piece of molten rock slashed through his pant leg. He bit back a cry, firing blindly. The trooper who'd thrown the charge staggered, chest smoking, then fell. He heard a roar of pain and saw Vera pinned against the wall by another soldier, a gauntlet crushing her windpipe. Her eyes blazed black, and the hum in her throat spiked. With a guttural snarl, she twisted free, driving a hidden blade into the trooper's side. He howled and toppled forward, blood staining the ice. She coughed, pressing a hand to her throat, then sprang at the next attacker with a speed that defied logic. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, with no room for mercy. Each kill demanded immediate violence. Dane's arms ached from recoil, and the acrid stench of scorched air filled his nostrils. Eventually, the echoes of combat faded, and the final trooper slumped to the ground. They stood amid the carnage, panting, battered. Both of them bled from cuts and scrapes, though none looked immediately fatal. The cavern's floor was littered with bodies, the ice stained dark. Exhaustion crashed down on them, but they were alive. The silence felt as heavy as the rock overhead. Vera wiped her blade on a fallen trooper's uniform. "Can't stay here. There could be more." Dane nodded, though weariness weighed on every muscle. He limped slightly, testing the wound on his leg, but it held. There's got to be another way out. They pressed on, deeper into the twisting passages. The faint glow of the troopers dropped flashlights, casting a ghostly glow on the ice. The temperature seemed to drop further the deeper they went, but at least they heard no more footsteps behind them. After nearly an hour of stumbling over uneven terrain, they emerged on the far side of the mountain, where the storm had died down slightly, revealing a slate-grey sky heavy with more snow. The horizon stretched out, revealing a valley below, dotted with black shapes that might be more Dominion patrols or perhaps some other threat entirely. Yet the alternative was to remain in the caves, where a second wave could box them in. They carefully descended into the valley, the snow crust crunching beneath their boots, the wind cutting through their gear. Vera led, her movements silent, eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. Dane followed, favoring his wounded leg, still gripping his rifle tightly. At the base of the slope, they found a sheltered alcove of stone. It blocked some of the wind, and they collapsed behind it, breathing hard. They'd traveled non-stop, survived 2 battles, and neither had truly slept. Dane pressed his head against the cold rock, letting the adrenaline ebb. Vera crouched nearby, face drawn with fatigue, yet still emanating that lethal energy. He rummaged through his pack, pulled out a ration bar and offered it without a word. She regarded it like it might be laced with poison, then snatched it from his hand, tearing into the wrapper. He let out a low chuckle, though nothing about their situation was funny. "Your laugh is irritating," she said flatly, biting into the bar. He shrugged. "Haven't had much to laugh about lately." She ate in silence, gaze drifting to the sky. For a moment, Dane studied her features, her high cheekbones, the inky hair bundled at the nape of her neck, the tight bodysuit that revealed every shift of muscle, and that emerald skin that gleamed with alien vitality. He couldn't ignore the wild kick of attraction in his gut, laced with fear. The memory of how close she'd come to killing him, and how easily she might still do so, roiled in his chest. But what unsettled him more was the flicker in her gaze when she looked back. Her eyes held a predator's calm, but also something else, something dangerously close to desire. The compulsion to close the distance between them, to see if that hum in her throat would change if he touched her, felt like a live wire in his veins. He tore his gaze away, focusing on rewrapping the bandage on his arm. The antiseptic had dried, and he winced at the sting. She watched, finishing the ration bar, eyes never leaving him. Finally, she moved closer, and he tensed, half expecting a blade at his throat. Instead, she knelt, nudging his hands aside. "You're doing it wrong," she said, voice barely, more than a growl. With surprising gentleness, she unwrapped the old bandage, inspected the wound, then reapplied fresh foam in a tighter wrap. Her fingers pressed firmly, but not cruelly. "Thanks," he muttered. She didn't respond verbally, just tightened the bandage and let her hands linger on his forearm for a second longer than necessary. He became acutely aware of how her skin felt, a cool emerald surface that radiated subtle heat from within, as though her body temperature was higher than his. The moment teetered on the edge of something, a line they both recognized. Then she pulled away, standing abruptly, turning her back to him. "Rest," she said, her tone clipped again. "I'll take watch." She walked a short distance, scanning the valley. He exhaled, letting the tension ease from his body. The physical fatigue was overwhelming. Despite the adrenaline still coursing through him, he felt his eyelids drooping. He tried to keep watch as well, but soon drifted, lulled by the wind's endless song. He wasn't sure how much time passed when a searing noise ripped him from sleep. He jolted awake, rifle up, scanning for threats. Vera was crouched behind a boulder, motioning for him to stay down. In the sky above, a large ship hovered, not a small gunship like before, something bigger, heavier, with enough weaponry to level half a mountain. Its searchlights cut across, the valley floor inching closer. If they were spotted, there'd be no escape. He cursed under his breath and crawled to Vera's side. Her eyes were black, reflecting the searchlight's glare. He could sense the tension in her posture. She gestured for them to move, pointing to a cluster of rocks. They scrambled, staying low, ignoring the protest of their battered bodies. A large chunk of the valley floor was open ground, with only intermittent cover. The ship's spotlight swept across the snow, creeping in their direction. They made a mad dash for the outcropping, hearts pounding. The searchlight fell behind them, then lurched forward, illuminating the space where they'd just been. They were nearly in the clear when a siren blared from the ship, and the whine of charging cannons filled the air. A volley of plasma fire scorched the ground, sending up bursts of steam and melted ice. Dane dived behind a ridge, Vera right behind him. The blasts hammered against the stone, shaking the ground with each impact. He knew they couldn't stay pinned down forever. The next round could obliterate them. He glanced at Vera. Her jaw was set, eyes gleaming gold with aggression. Together, without words, they broke cover, sprinting in a zigzag pattern to throw off the gunners. More plasma scorched the earth, splattering them with mud and half-melted snow. Up ahead, Dane spotted a crevice leading into another section of rocky foothills. If they reached it, the ship might not be able to maneuver as easily. "There!" he shouted, voice drowned out by cannon fire. He jerked his head, hoping she saw. She nodded, and they pushed themselves harder, every muscle screaming in protest. The final stretch was a gauntlet of scorching blasts and near misses. They hit the crevice, skidding on loose gravel. The walls were narrow, forcing them to press through sideways in some spots. The thunder of the ship's cannons faded behind. Layers of rock, though the echoes persisted. When they finally emerged on the other side, they collapsed against the stone, chests heaving. Dane's body felt like it was at its limit, muscles spent, head spinning. Vera wasn't in much better shape. Her breath came in ragged bursts, the hum in her throat fluttering at intervals like a stuttering heartbeat. Sweat, or something akin to it, glistened on her emerald skin. Adrenaline still coursed through, them fueling a reckless energy that neither could vent through combat anymore. He turned his head, meeting her gaze. In the dim light, her eyes seemed to swirl between black and gold. The chaos of it, the near death, the raw survival, was a tangible force between them. She shifted, rising onto her knees, and his breath caught at the predatory look on her face. He swallowed. What now? She moved closer, her presence dominating the narrow space. Her hand came to his chest, pressing firmly enough that he felt the solidity of her strength. He froze, unsure if this was an attack or something else. He tasted blood in his mouth, his lips split from the mad sprint. He should have been thinking about the next escape route, about the unstoppable ship overhead. But all he could do was track the movement of her eyes as they traced his face, lingering on his scar, then dipping lower. Her voice was a growl. "I should kill you. I was sent to kill you." He let out a shaky breath. "So do it." She leaned in, the hum in her throat intensifying. "I might," she murmured. Then she kissed him, hard, fierce, nothing gentle about it. He froze for a heartbeat, stunned, but the surge of heat in his veins was impossible to ignore. He responded, grabbing her hips, pulling her closer until she was straddling him in the cramped space. It was a clash as much as a kiss. She bit, his lip copper tang flooding his mouth, but instead of revulsion, he felt a deeper hunger ignite. He pressed her back against the stone, the friction of the rough surface scraping against her bodysuit. She let out a ragged sound, half snarl, half moan. Their breaths collided as they fought for control, neither yielding. Her skin felt electric beneath his hands, the alien texture subtly different from human flesh, slicker, smoother, and hotter. Her fingertips dug into his shoulders, as though she couldn't decide whether to push him away or pull him in deeper. He took the initiative, trailing his mouth down the line of her jaw, tasting salt and the faint, exotic flavor of her. She hissed in approval, or maybe warning. He pressed a thigh between her legs, and she ground against him, biting back another moan. Their desperation to dominate each other mirrored the lethal dance they'd fought hours earlier. Every muscle in his body strained, half expecting a blade in his ribs at any moment. But also craving that spark of danger like a drug. The rocky ground dug into his knees, but he barely felt it as she pulled at his tactical vest, tugging it free. The cold air hit his sweat-damp shirt, and she pressed closer, seeking his warmth. He felt the suction of her lips against his neck, the scrape of teeth. He hissed at the sting, but found himself arching into it, letting the pain blur with the pleasure. With a feral growl, she tore open a seam in his shirt, exposing the hard plane of his chest. Her palm pressed against his skin, and he felt a bizarre vibration spread from her touch. as though her very essence hummed into him. He groaned, leaning forward to kiss her again, the two of them locked in a brutal struggle of tongues and teeth, raw, hungry, unstoppable. He pinned her wrists against the rock, eyes blazing with a challenge. She glared up at him, defiant, chest heaving, lips parted. Then she twisted, slipping free with inhuman grace, shoving him onto his back. She straddled his hips, both of them, panting in the dusty, narrow canyon. The tension crackled, a taut wire that could snap at any second. Her bodysuit peeled away as if responding to her will, revealing emerald skin that shimmered in the low light. He stared, momentarily awed by the lethal beauty of her form. Scars, faint but visible, traced patterns across her sides, a testament to battles survived. She wore each one like a badge of honor. His hands slid up her thighs, feeling the shift of muscle beneath that smooth skin. She lowered herself against him, and his world narrowed to the sensation of her body enveloping his. The moan that tore from his throat was lost in her fierce kiss. They moved in a heated rhythm, the tension of their earlier battles translating into an almost combative union. She'd push, he'd pull, she'd scratch, he'd grip, pain and pleasure fused, scorching away any doubt. Time seemed to warp, each second stretched thin by the raw, pounding desire that consumed them. The sound of her alien hum hit a crescendo, a throaty vibration that rippled through his chest. Each wave of sensation felt sharper, more intense. The lingering danger, a potent aphrodisiac. His fingers dug into her hips, guiding her movements, meeting her thrust for thrust until the air vibrated with ragged gasps and stifled cries. When the final crest came, it crashed over them like an avalanche, ripping away any semblance of control. She clung to him, face twisted in what might have been ecstasy or fury. He let out a guttural moan, eyes squeezed shut, consciousness narrowing, to the blazing heat where they joined. For a breathless moment, neither moved, suspended in the aftermath of their violent passion. Then he collapsed onto his back, chest heaving. She rolled off him, also struggling for air, her body still trembling, with aftershocks. The cold rock against his sweat-slick skin reminded him of where they were. Slowly, the reality of their situation seeped back in. The enemy was still out there, the war still raged, and this moment, as intense as it was, changed nothing and everything. She stirred, rising onto an elbow to stare down at him. Her eyes were that swirling gold again, an unreadable mixture of emotions. He met her gaze, unsure what to say or do. Part of him expected her to reach for her blade, to finish what she'd started days ago. Instead, she leaned over him, lips curling in a predatory smirk. "You're lucky I don't devour humans the way my kind devours lesser prey." He blinked, still coming down from the adrenaline high. "I thought that was all you did," he managed. Her smile widened, revealing unnervingly sharp canines. "That was before I discovered a better way to consume you." He felt a shiver race through him, torn between arousal and fear. "So that's it? I'm food now?" She laughed, a low, throaty sound that sent a ripple of tension through the narrow space. "Not quite, but I might need a taste." Her gaze dropped to his neck, and he remembered the brief sting when she'd bitten him there moments ago. Before he could protest or question her intent. She bent down, lips brushing the throbbing pulse in his throat. He inhaled sharply as her mouth opened, teeth grazing his skin. The pressure increased, and he realized with a jolt that she was actually breaking the surface. A sharp sting, followed by the warmth of blood trickling. He tensed, a spike of alarm, flaring in his mind. She clamped onto him with surprising gentleness, though the act was undeniably predatory. He felt a rush of vertigo, the mix of pain, warmth, and the intimate suction of her mouth. He might have tried to shove her off, but he was drained, and some part of him was too entranced to move. She made a soft, low noise, something like pleasure or satisfaction. Seconds later she withdrew, licking her lips, eyes darkening with what looked like rapture. She pressed a hand to the small wound, stopping the blood flow. He breathed hard, a swirl of emotions tangling in his chest. Fear, fascination, and an odd surge of arousal. "You..." He struggled for words, the taste of copper still on his own tongue. "That's how you feed?" She exhaled, seeming momentarily sated. "We can. We choose, sometimes for nourishment, sometimes for other reasons." Her voice held a cryptic edge that only deepened the spell. He swallowed. "Am I going to turn into something?" The question sounded insane, but nothing about this was normal. She flashed a grin. "No, human. You'll remain yourself." She touched the cut gently, a faint humming purr rumbling in her throat as though soothing him. "Your species is odd. Your blood is different." He wasn't sure if it was a compliment or an insult, but he couldn't deny the pulse of fascination thrumming between them, even as the cold wind swept through the crevice and the knowledge of the war looming over them returned. He felt drawn to her in a way that defied logic. They were enemies, but they'd found a fragile alliance. They were so different, yet had shared something raw and undeniable. They dressed in the silence that followed, each mindful of the other's lethal potential. But the tension between them had shifted. They'd crossed a line that might make returning to hostility that much harder, or that much easier. Dane secured his gear, wincing at the bruises forming along his chest and neck. She moved with a languid confidence, still predatory. But no, longer, purely focused on killing him. He glanced at the faint mark on his neck, still throbbing but not bleeding. "You could have asked." Her lips twisted in a smirk. "Would you have said yes?" He didn't answer because he wasn't. Sure, his heart still drummed a frantic beat from the entire encounter. She stepped closer, pressing a firm hand to his cheek. Their eyes locked, and a strange understanding passed between them. This was bigger than a momentary truce. Something had altered the dynamic in ways neither fully grasped, yet it bound them tighter than before. "Now what?" he asked, voice still rough. She exhaled softly. "We still have an army hunting us. My mission was to kill you. But now, I can't deliver your corpse if I want that intel. My superiors might pay a fortune for it." He arched a brow. "So I'm still a bargaining chip. And you're still a traitor. We've just complicated things." She tilted her head. "We need to move. If they bring in heavy reinforcements, we won't make it across the valley alive." They scrambled out of the crevice, setting a brisk pace toward the valley's edge. By now, they'd grown accustomed to each other's presence. She still led with that swift, quiet stride, while he kept watch behind them, ensuring they weren't followed. Their wounds ached, but the desperation to escape fueled them. Whenever they caught each other's gaze, there was a spark of memory, an echo of the passion that had ignited moments ago. They traversed the terrain for hours, coming across smaller patrols that they avoided or quickly dispatched. Neither spoke about the intensity that crackled whenever they were forced to huddle close in cover or when they brushed against each other in a narrow pass. The memory of her mouth on his throat lingered, sending a jolt through him whenever he recalled. Eventually they reached a cliff overlooking a winding river far below. The path down looked treacherous, littered with ice-coated boulders. But crossing the river might be their best chance to leave these mountains behind and get closer to a safe zone, or at least one less patrolled by Dominion forces. As they prepared to descend, the ground shook. Vera froze, looking up. Dain followed her gaze. On the distant horizon, a massive shape blotted out the sky, an Imperial carrier big enough to deploy an entire battalion. His stomach sank. This was escalating beyond kill squads. This was an extermination force. "They found you or they found us," Vera muttered, her jaw set. "We won't outrun that." Dane clenched his fists. "No, so we need another plan." She turned to him, eyes gleaming with an idea. "You have intel that the Dominion wants. Maybe we can use it against them, force them to stand down." He frowned. "I doubt they'll negotiate. They want to crush all threats, especially me." A mirthless smile curled her lips. "Then we make them an offer they can't refuse. We'll have to get closer, find their command center, a direct infiltration." He stared at her like she was insane. Then again, so was he. Sounds like a suicide mission. She shrugged, the tension in her posture betraying her own fear. It might be, but you're out of time, human. If we don't do something, that carrier will flatten these mountains. The logic was cold, but irresistible. He felt the familiar coil of determination in his chest, the one that had spurred him to defect in the first place. If he was going to die, better to go down fighting, maybe even crippling the Dominion in the process. Their eyes locked. Words were unnecessary. They both knew the stakes. Slowly, he nodded. And the moment he did, she leaned in, brushing her lips against his in a brief, possessive gesture that sent heat through his veins. Then she pulled back, face set in grim resolve. We end this. They descended the cliff, half sliding, half climbing, each movement fraught with peril. The sun sank, leaving the sky a cold grey and the valleys below filled with shadows. By the time they reached the bottom, night had nearly fallen. They could see lights flickering on the horizon, Dominion patrols, setting up temporary command posts. They moved under the cover of darkness, slipping past sentries with quiet efficiency. Vera's alien senses, honed by years of stealth missions, proved invaluable. She guided them through hidden ravines and thick groves of snow-laden trees. Dain provided backup when they needed to take out a guard or two, his aim unwavering despite his wounds. In this lethal dance, they complemented each other, fear and desire melding into a singular focus: survive and strike hard. The terrain leveled out, opening onto a plain where a command outpost had been hastily constructed. Shield generators formed a dome of shimmering energy around rows of vehicles and tents. Armed soldiers roamed the perimeter in disciplined patterns. High above, the looming carrier floated, spotlights scanning the night. From behind a broken ridge, they observed the setup. That central tent, Dain muttered, pointing to a larger, heavily guarded structure. That must be their command center. They'll have comm arrays, intelligence terminals. If I can jack in, I can broadcast the data I stole, expose them to half the galaxy. She smirked, though tension radiated off her. And that's worth dying for? He locked eyes with her. It's worth everything. She nodded once, then turned back to the outpost. We'll need a distraction, something big enough to draw them away from that tent while you get inside. I'll handle it. His chest tightened. You're going alone? She arched a brow. We'll meet at the tent's entrance in 10 minutes. If I'm not there, go without me. When he opened his mouth to argue, she cut him off. Don't waste time. This is the only way. He swallowed. There was a gravity in her gaze that left no room for debate. She stepped closer, pressing her palm against his cheek again. The intensity of her stare made his pulse pound. We do this, she said quietly. And if we survive, perhaps you'll let me devour you again. His breath caught. He cupped the back of her neck, bringing her in for a swift, burning kiss that tasted of fear and promise. I'm counting on it. She pulled away, eyes black with resolve. Then she vanished into the darkness, a silent predator on the hunt. Dain watched her go, chest tight, before slipping around the perimeter, inching closer to the command tent. He crouched behind a low wall of sandbags, scanning for an opening. Moments later, all hell broke loose on the far side of the outpost. Explosions lit the night in a cascade of orange fire. Shouts rose in confusion, sirens blared, and soldiers rushed toward the chaos. Gunfire crackled and a secondary blast rocked the ground. She was making a statement, and it was working. Dain seized the opportunity, darting to the tent's entrance, taking out a lone guard with a swift strike to the throat. He slipped inside. The interior was lit by flickering monitors and a holomap table at the center. Several officers scrambled in panic, barking orders. He took down 2 with silenced plasma shots, then forced the third at gunpoint to grant him access to the main console. He plugged in a small device, hacking the system. Lines of code scrolled across the screen as he navigated the Dominions, firewall searching for the broadcast channel. Adrenaline hammered in his skull. Outside, the noise of the battle raged. signifying that Vera was still engaged in her deadly dance of destruction. Every second counted. Finally, he found it. The data he'd stolen. The list of high-ranking Dominion collaborators, the evidence of war crimes, the vulnerabilities in their starship fleets. He uploaded all of it. The screen flashed as he set it to broadcast on every open channel across the sector. Even if they jammed some signals, enough would slip through, dooming them to public scrutiny and rebellion. But as he hit the final command, an alarm blared. Dominion reinforcements had arrived. 2 troopers stormed into the tent, opening fire. Dane dove behind a crate, returning shots. He took one down, but the second pinned him, bullets shredding the air an inch over his head. The hack needed a few more seconds to finalize. The trooper advanced, stepping around the console. Dane sprang, tackling him to the ground. They grappled, rolling across the tent floor. A stray blast from the trooper's gun shattered a control panel, sending sparks flying. Dane managed to wrest the gun free, smashing it into the trooper's visor. The trooper spat blood, trying to draw a knife, but Dane slammed him again and again until he went limp. Breathing hard, Dane scrambled back to the console. The data upload read complete. He pulled the device, pocketing it. A sense of grim satisfaction washed over him. Even if he died here, the Dominion's secrets were out. He grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, scanning for any sign of Vera. Smoke choked the air. Part of the outpost lay in ruins, flames devouring supply crates and vehicles. Sirens wailed, soldiers ran in confusion. He spotted her, locked in a vicious melee with 3 troopers, her blade flashing under the harsh floodlights. She took down 2 in a flurry of lethal blows, but the third cracked her across the jaw with a rifle butt, sending her to her knees. Dane rushed forward, firing. The shot took the trooper in the side, dropping him instantly. Vera staggered, shaking her head. He reached her just as she collapsed against him, her breath ragged. Blood seeped from a cut on her temple. "Can you run?" he asked, voice raw with concern. She glared at him, that same savage defiance burning in her eyes. A small nod. He slung her arm over his shoulder, supporting her as they fled the camp, weaving between burning debris. Plasma fire chased their heels, but they kept moving, hearts pounding in unison. They reached the perimeter just as a deafening roar cracked the sky. The carrier had opened fire, unleashing a volley of heavy ordnance on the outpost, presumably to destroy evidence of the breach. Explosions erupted behind them, flattening tents and men alike. The shockwave knocked them off their feet, slamming them into the snow. Dazed and choking on smoke, Dayin pushed himself up, dragging Vera with him. They stumbled away from the carnage, each step a struggle. His vision blurred, lungs searing. He wasn't sure how long they ran, guided only by survival instinct. Eventually, the roar of the carrier faded into the distance, replaced by the quiet hiss of wind across the snow. They found refuge in a shallow gully, hidden from overhead sensors. He sank to his knees, gently lowering Vera. Her emerald skin looked dull, her breathing shallow. He reached for the foam canister, sealing the cut on her temple, then tore open her bodysuit enough to find a nasty gash on her side. Gently, he applied first aid, hands trembling from the cold and fear. She remained still, eyes half-lidded, jaw clenched tight against pain. He pressed a hand to her cheek, remembering how she'd done the same to him. The hum in her throat was faint, unsteady. "Hang on," he murmured. "Don't you die on me." Her gaze flickered open. "I'm not that easy to kill," she rasped. She tried to smile, but it turned into a grimace. "Did you succeed?" He nodded. "I got the intel out. The whole galaxy will know what they've done. That war you've been fighting, it's about to change." She exhaled, relief mixing with exhaustion. "Then my mission is complete too." He stroked, a thumb over her temple, brushing away a rivulet of blood. Their eyes met, a flood of unspoken emotion in that brief contact. It wasn't softness exactly, but something akin to respect and a deeper bond forged in blood and violence. "Rest," he said softly. "I'll keep watch." She nodded, her body going limp, but not before her hand found his, squeezing once. He felt the faint rumble of her purr, a reassuring vibration, that told him she was still alive, still the lethal, captivating force he couldn't shake. He squeezed back. The night crawled on. He kept vigilant, scanning the skies for more ships, straining his ears for the telltale hum of approaching troopers. The cold was unrelenting, seeping into his bones. He fought to stay awake, to keep Vera warm, to stave off the creeping dread that the Dominion might retaliate in force. But the sky remained empty, aside from distant stars. When morning came, a pale sun cast weak light across the snowy gully. Vera stirred, shifting against him. He checked her wounds. They were sealed, but still raw. She managed to sit up, wincing. He helped her stand, draping one of the stolen thermal blankets around. Her shoulders. They exchanged no words of love or endearment. There was no room for that in their brutal reality. But there was a mutual understanding in their shared glance. They had survived something impossible. They had irrevocably entwined their fates. They began walking together through the snow, supporting one another's weight. The broadcast he'd sent would upend the Dominion's plans, exposing their atrocities. Her own faction might see her as compromised or as a hero, depending on how they spun it. He wasn't sure what awaited them beyond the mountains, but he knew they had to keep moving. They'd achieved a blow against a common enemy, and perhaps that was enough. Eventually, the slope descended into a rolling landscape of ice plains, with the faint silhouette of distant hills at the horizon. Their steps were slow, but determined. He thought of all the times he'd cursed the cold, yearned for warmth. And here he was, side by side with a lethal alien who'd nearly killed him and devoured him in more ways than one. The memory of that devouring sent a renewed shiver down his spine, mingling fear with a hunger that startled him. When they paused to rest, she turned to face him, eyes a shifting mix of gold and violet, a reflection of her swirling emotions. "You tasted interesting," she said, a hint of a smirk playing on her lips. "If the rumors are true, the feeding could be addictive. Perhaps we should be careful." He touched the faint bruise on his neck, feeling an echo of that moment. "I'm not sure caution's our strong suit." Her smile was fierce. "No, it isn't." They resumed their trek, each step forward a step away from the war zone and toward an uncertain future. They were still hunted. They were still killers on opposite sides of a conflict that might never truly end. But they had forged a bond in blood, sex, and survival, and that bond felt unbreakable. He glanced at her, recalling how she'd said she might devour him. A strange warmth flooded him, mingling with a glint of humor. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "are you still planning to eat me?" She arched a brow. "I already have, but I might do it again." Despite the cold, a faint flush colored his cheeks. "I'll try not to disappoint." They pressed on through the snow, bruised and bloody, but alive. And though danger lurked in every shadow, though the Dominion might still be on their trail, an electric current of anticipation flowed between them, binding them together in a world that wanted them apart. He thought about everything that had happened, the lethal battles, the frantic, desperate intimacy, and that moment of letting her feed from him, and he knew with a certainty that made him shudder. The next time she devoured him, it wouldn't be an act of war, but one of raw, undeniable hunger. They moved under that cold sun, heading into the unknown, two hardened warriors with a fire burning between them. No words could define what they were to each other now. Allies, enemies, lovers, maybe all three. But they were free, and they had beaten impossible odds. As they vanished into the distance, the winds picked up again, erasing their footprints in the endless white. The mountains behind them stood in silent testimony to the battles fought, the secrets revealed, and the bond forged in violence and need. No one would know the details of this journey, but the galaxy would feel its impact soon enough. And in that expanse of snow and sky, with the taste of each other's blood and desire still fresh on their tongues, they carried on, bound by the knowledge that even the ruthless can love in their own brutal way.